Take a look at this clip.
A lot of good things have come out about the hydroxy. A lot of good things have come out. I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine.
This clip was taken during the pandemic. It's of President Trump endorsing the use of hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ, as a means of preventing or treating COVID. Trump says that he is taking it himself because he's, quote, heard some good stories.
I've heard a lot of good stories.
Well, in today's video, I want to tell you what story he heard, because it's probably the story of Didier Raoult, a French scientist born in Senegal who recently has been unveiled as one of the least ethical medical researchers of all time. It was his research and the research of his institution that most strongly supported the use of hydroxychloroquine as a means of battling COVID. But the problems with Didier Raoult's research turned out to have started long before COVID was ever a thing. So let's talk about him. Our story starts in 2011. Raoult was selected to lead the newly created IHU, one of 6 state-of-the-art hospitals commissioned by the then President Nicolas Sarkozy's government. This was a big investment. The IHU was launched with a €72 million grant from the French government. And with all of that funding and infrastructure, the IHU under Raoult's leadership quickly became a formidable institution with a lot of political and financial backing. So, by the time we get to 2020, which is when Europe starts paying serious attention to the pandemic, the IHU, and by extension its leader Raoult, are in prime position to be authorities on how France should lead the pandemic response. Which, during the pandemic, is a very powerful position to be in, because the people of France, just like all of us in the world, were scared, uncertain, and desperate for information about how best to deal with this new threat. And the French media knew this, and so what happened was that Raoult became a regular feature on French news. Apparently, if you were in France at the time, you could turn on the news and every day find a new interview with Raoult about the pandemic. One social scientist called Antoine Bristier said it became a self-reinforcing phenomenon. The media were interested in what he was saying, and so he came to be really powerful in the French population. And then, of course, the media wanted him because he was able to attract large audiences. But all this attention on Raoult meant that anything that he said on national television would be put under the highest amount of scrutiny. So, it came as a major shock to everyone when Raoult confidently asserted on national television that hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ, was an effective treatment against COVID. It was a shock to many, especially in the medical community, because there was little to no evidence supporting this fact. In fact, the only thing that remotely alluded to HCQ being a possible good treatment for COVID at the time was this page-and-a-half letter of an ongoing report in China. It's not even like a proper scientific peer-reviewed paper with, methods and statistical techniques. It's hardly anything. So, this very poorly evidenced assertion by Raoult on national television caught the attention of a lot of critics. One of those critics was a guy called Victor Garcia, a journalist at the magazine L'Express in France. Garcia wanted to know why Raoult and the IHU were so confident in the use of HCQ against COVID. So, as a journalist, he decided to find out and called up the IHU to get more details. But when he called up the IHU, he was met with a strange response. His request for details was met by a message from a scientist called Jean-Marc Rolin. And Rolin, rather than give details to Garcia about an ongoing trial they had or about evidence that was, going to be published soon, instead Rolin simply told Garcia, "I am a scientist. If I tell you to take chloroquine, you'll listen to me." Not very reassuring. But skeptics of Raoult, like Garcia, were the minority. Most of the French population saw Raoult and his institution, the IHU, as real authorities on how to lead the pandemic response. And this was confirmed when the French health minister, Olivier Véran, invited Raoult to be part of his special scientific council that was advising the government on how to deal with the pandemic response. Obviously, a very powerful position for any scientist to be in. And within just a few days of Raoult gaining this very powerful position, he and his colleagues at the IHU published a bombshell paper. It was this paper. It was called Hydroxychloroquine and Azithromycin as a treatment of COVID-19, results of an open-label, non-randomized clinical trial. This paper claimed that if you combined hydroxychloroquine with the antibiotic azithromycin, that was an effective treatment of COVID-19. And remember the context for this announcement. This is long before any vaccines were developed, long before we had any of the techniques that we use today to treat COVID. So at this time, COVID is still very novel to the world. People are desperate for any kind of possible treatment for the condition. And so when this paper dropped coming out of the IHU in France, the hype around hydroxychloroquine surged. The media went crazy. People were so excited to hear that there's a new treatment for COVID-19. Hydroxychloroquine hype on social media went viral. And it was this hype over hydroxychloroquine that led to this.
I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine.
As you probably know, the media can be biased and sometimes low in factuality, which is why I choose to read my news with the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. If you don't already know, Ground News is a website and app that gathers the world's media in one place and makes the bias of that media explicit rather than hidden. So, since we've already mentioned Donald Trump in this video, let's demonstrate Ground News by talking about this news story about Donald Trump about a man setting himself on fire outside of Donald Trump's hush money trial. As I can see from Ground News, I can tell that this was a big story because I see a large number of sources reporting on it. I can also see the biased distribution of these sources. It is relatively balanced between left and right-leaning sources, with the majority of reporting coming from center-leaning sources. And if I want to delve deeper into any one of these sources to read their coverage of the story, I can select my sources based on the handy tags that Ground News adds to each different source. For example, I might be inclined to read the Post and Courier's coverage of this story, as I can see that they are an independently funded, high factuality, center-leaning source. Whereas personally, I may be less inclined to read this source from the Gateway Pundit, because I can see that they are a far right-leaning source, low in factuality, and independently funded by some guy called Jim Hoft. So that's why I love reading my news on Ground News. It helps me keep informed in the least biased way possible. Also, side note, there are no ads on Ground News because they're funded by people like me and you who sign up for their subscription plan, so it's really nice to read news without annoying ads popping up. So if you would like to sign up to Ground News, use my link in the description. It's ground.news/Pete. If you use my link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan that'll give you access to all the features I just talked to you about. There's a link in the description, but there's also this QR code on screen right now if you want to scan that instead. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to talking about Didier Raoult, because we're just getting to the juicy bit, which is the investigations into Raoult's research. So, after Raoult and his colleagues published this bombshell paper claiming that HCQ is an effective treatment for COVID, a lot of skeptics decided to look over the quality of this paper. One of whom, as you might have guessed, is channel favorite Elizabeth Bick. If you don't know who she is, we've talked about her a lot on this channel already. She is a science integrity detective of sorts. She looks for evidence of data fraud and image manipulation in lots of different papers. She's the one who caught out the president of Stanford University, Mark Tessier-Levine, which led to his resignation. She's also caught evidence of image manipulation in Nobel Prize winners, in Harvard professors, and many other people as well. She's an absolute legend, in my opinion, and she was also heavily involved in this Didier Raoult case. But this time it wasn't image manipulation that she found when she looked into his papers. Instead, it was something a lot more worrying: ethical failings. So let's talk about some of the things that she found in this paper. The first red flag that she pointed out was that this medical trial was not randomized. And if you're not shocked by that, let me explain why randomization is so important. Randomization is important because randomizing patients to what treatment group they are given is how you mitigate a lot of bias in research. If you don't randomize your sample, that means that researchers can do things like look for patients who already are recovering and put them in the treatment group for hydroxychloroquine, and then find patients who are really, really sick and likely to never recover and put them in the control group, making hydroxychloroquine look better than it really is. We don't know if that's actually what happened here, but the fact that it wasn't randomized means that that is a possibility. Also, randomization is important because it helps to control for different confounding demographic variables between your different groups. For example, in this study about hydroxychloroquine, Elizabeth Bick found that the control group were remarkably young, all of them being between the age of 10 and 20, whereas the people who were receiving hydroxychloroquine were all aged 25 and up. That means that age could be a confounding variable here, making the results not trustworthy. Additionally, some of the patients in this study, as I said, were as young as 10 years old. But the paper said that patients who were under the age of 12 were supposed to be excluded from this sample. So this was clearly an ethical violation. And perhaps worst of all, Elizabeth Bick found 6 patients who received hydroxychloroquine who were not included in the final data. It was later discovered that 3 of those 6 missing patients actually went to an intensive care unit, and so that's why they weren't included. But they presumably went to an intensive care unit because, well, their condition got worse despite receiving hydroxychloroquine. And one of them actually died. So guess what? If you don't include the people who receive your drug and die, then it makes your drug look a lot more effective than it really is. But Bick wasn't the only skeptic who looked into this paper. Another person was a guy called Besançon, and what Besançon found was that one of the co-authors on the paper was actually the editor-in-chief of the journal that the paper was published in, which is clearly a red flag when it comes to the trustworthiness of this research, especially when Besançon noticed how short the peer review time was. But despite this early criticism, over the following weeks, Raoul and his team of researchers at the IHU would publish 2 more papers supporting the use of HCQ to treat COVID. One of these was a study on 80 COVID patients who all received HCQ, and according to their results, all showed clinically improved results after receiving the treatment. When skeptics looked into that study, they found that this study had not been approved by any of France's ethical committees, which is a legal requirement when anyone in France is to do biomedical research. Instead, this study was only approved by IHU's internal ethical committee, which is not independent of the IHU. When questioned about this, Raoul and the other authors of the study defended this internal ethics approval by saying that it was not necessary for them to get a normal ethical approval from one of France's ethics boards, because this was apparently a retrospective study where they were only looking back at patient files after they had received normal care. But in my opinion, it seems a bit weird that normal care at the IHU involves administrating HCQ, a drug which has very poor evidence of working, to patients suffering from COVID. So this practice of operating in an ethical grey area on this study put a target on Raoul's back for skeptics, and they decided to look into Raoul's research not just for his COVID work, but for his entire publication history. And boy did they find a lot. But while there were a few skeptics who were really suspicious of Raoul's work, in general, France's opinion of Raoul was overwhelmingly positive. Apparently during the pandemic, there were over 90 Facebook groups supporting Raoul with over 1.1 million members. He was so popular, in fact, that apparently at Christmas you could buy a Santon of Raoul, which apparently is a tradition in Provence where you decorate your nativity scene with local heroes and characters. Well, those Christmas photos are not gonna age well, because it turns out Raoul's ethical issues started long before COVID. Do you remember Garcia, the journalist at L'Express, who called up the IHU and received that strange response, "I am a scientist, if I tell you to take chloroquine, you'll take it"? Well, in July 2021, Garcia published his investigation into the IHU in L'Express, where he found 17 different studies between the years 2011 and 2020 that all used the same ethical approval number. These studies weren't similar at all. They were all looking at different research questions with different methodologies, and each time that a different research question and a different methodology is being used, you're supposed to get a brand new ethical approval number. And what's even more dodgy is that most of these studies involved using homeless people and refugees as test subjects. One study involved taking nasal swabs from a homeless shelter. Another one took sputum samples from a homeless shelter to test for tuberculosis. Sputum is, mucus of the lungs. But it turns out that Garcia's investigation and him finding these 17 studies, well, 17 was just the tip of the iceberg. Another skeptic of Raoul's, a guy called Fabrice Frank, decided to spend his lockdown scrolling through Google Scholar to look at different IHU papers. And he found not 17, but 248 studies that all use the same ethics number. It was 09022, which means that one application to the IHU Internal Ethics Committee was used to do 248 studies. Now, Raoul responded to this accusation by saying that this was above board because all of these studies involve the same kind of research: analysis of human feces collected during standard care or from waste, which is a kind of research that apparently does not fall under French bioethics law. But according to a lawyer who specializes in human experimentation, a guy called Emile said that this was simply not true. Many of the studies involved things that were completely unrelated to feces and human waste. They were collecting samples like urine, like blood, like vaginal samples, and even breast milk, all of which should have triggered a brand new application for new ethical approval. But again, that's not even the most dodgy part of all of this. The most dodgy part, once again, is who these studies are being done on. A lot of these studies were conducted on children, and nearly half of them were done outside of France, with a lot of them being done in all kinds of different African countries where the ethical approval in that country was hazy or non-existent. So as more investigations into Raoul and the IHU were released, a clear pattern emerged. What you had here was a hospital that regularly mixed patient care with research. You had a research hospital that relied heavily on its internal ethics committee, which was not independent enough to provide objective ethical assessment. And perhaps worst of all, you had a culture of researchers targeting vulnerable people who may not have known what they were consenting to, or perhaps even worse, not even thinking that they had a choice. Eventually, 18 months after Elizabeth Bick first raised ethical concerns about Raoul and his colleagues at the IHU, the French government asked 2 auditing bodies to investigate. The reports came out in 2022, confirming what I've told you here today, and they even went on to say that some patients received unapproved tuberculosis treatment, with some suffering, quote, severe adverse effects, which could be considered as a criminal offense, according to them. The auditing reports did not specifically blame Raoul for these failings, but they did say that Raoul tightly held the reins of power within the institute, with quotes from employees saying things like Raoul was omnipresent, the final decision maker, and that other managers were in total conformity with Raoul's views. And so you would think that was it, right? Raoul's been caught, GG, the gig's up, go home. But no. In April 2023, a year after the reports come out, and still while Raoul and the IHU are under a lot of scrutiny, the IHU and Raoul publish a paper that has been dubbed as possibly the largest, most unethical study in the history of France, perhaps the world. This draft paper that Raoul and his colleagues released showed that not 10, not 100, but 23,172 COVID-19 patients were treated at the IHU with hydroxychloroquine between March 2020 and December 2021, which is absolutely insane thing to publish because it was well known that France banned the use of HCQ as a treatment for COVID-19 in May 2020. And why was HCQ banned? Because more reliable research came out showing that HCQ had no effect on COVID whatsoever, but did increase people's risk of many different side effects. It was an absolute disaster. So, where is Raoul now? Well, so far, Raoul has earned himself 10 different retractions and over 100 expressions of concern on his research papers. But he's retired, so he can't lose his job. The French Medicines Agency, the ANSM, said that it would file criminal charges against the IHU, and how that will affect Didier Raoul is so far unclear. As for the people who criticized him, well, they have received a lot of abuse from Raoul and his supporters. And Elizabeth Bick, who you'll remember was one of the first people to express concern over Raoul's papers, well, Raoul actually filed charges against Bick in April 2021 for harassment and blackmail. But Raoul ended up losing his case in April 2022. Thank goodness. So, what do you make of Raoul and the IHU? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I want to say a big thank you to this article from Science, which was my main source for this video. I also want to thank Ground News for sponsoring this video. If you guys haven't checked out Ground News yet, be sure to do so. Link in the description. And a big thank you to you guys for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.